It was a cold, moonless night when David set out on a long drive. He was heading home after a long day at work, his car loaded with his briefcase and a steaming cup of coffee in the cup holder. The highway stretched out before him, a ribbon of black asphalt surrounded by empty fields and the occasional darkened house. He didn't think much of the quiet. After all, it was past midnight, and most people were fast asleep. David turned on the radio to keep himself awake. Static crackled through the speakers, but no stations came through. Frustrated, he turned it off, relying on the hum of his engine and the steady thrum of his tires to keep him alert. The drive started out uneventful. He passed a few trucks, their headlights glowing like fireflies in the distance. The road signs flashed by, their reflective letters guiding him forward. Exit 49, 15 miles. He checked his dashboard clock. It was just after 1 a.m. If he kept his speed steady, he'd be home by 2. But then, something odd happened. David realized he hadn't seen another car in nearly half an hour. The highway seemed deserted, even though it was a major route. The silence started to feel oppressive. He turned up the heater, trying to shake off the chill creeping into his bones. As he drove, he noticed something even stranger. The mile markers on the side of the road weren't changing. They all read mile 156, no matter how far he drove. At first, he thought it was a mistake. Maybe the markers hadn't been updated. But after 20 minutes, he grew uneasy. He should have passed dozens of markers by now, yet they all remained the same. David shook his head, trying to focus. "It's just fatigue," he muttered to himself. "I'm seeing." He decided to pull over and take a break. His car slowed to a stop on the shoulder, and he stepped out, stretching his stiff legs. The air was freezing, and the darkness felt unnaturally thick. He grabbed his phone to check the GPS, but it wouldn't load. No signal, not even one bar. "Great," he grumbled, climbing back into the car. He turned the key, and the engine roared to life, but as he pulled back onto the highway, a shiver ran down his spine. He could have sworn he saw something, or someone, standing in the distance, just barely visible in his rearview mirror. A pale figure, unmoving, watching. David glanced back, but the road behind him was empty. He laughed nervously, chalking it up to his imagination. He pressed the accelerator, eager to get. Another 20 minutes passed, and his anxiety grew. The highway felt endless. No exits, no landmarks, just the same repetitive stretch of road. Even the trees lining the side of the highway looked identical, as if they were part of a looping backdrop in some cheap video game. And then, he saw it. Up ahead, a car was parked on the side of the road, its hazard lights flashing. David slowed down, relief washing over him at the sight of another person. As he pulled closer, he noticed the car's hood was open, and a figure stood beside it, waving. David rolled down. "Need some help?" he called out. The figure stepped closer, illuminated by his headlights. It was a man in his 40s, wearing a dirty jacket and jeans. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes looked sunken, as if he hadn't slept in days. "Yeah," the man said, his voice raspy. "My car broke down. Been stuck here for hours. Can you give me a ride to the next exit?" David hesitated. Something about the man felt off, but he didn't want to leave him stranded. "Sure," he said finally. "Hop in." The man climbed into the passenger seat, and David couldn't help but notice how cold the air in the car became as soon as the door shut. He glanced at the man's hands. They were trembling slightly, but not from the cold. They looked almost decayed, like the skin was peeling away. David swallowed hard, trying to ignore the unease settling in his stomach. "Where were you heading?" he asked, trying to make small "Home," the man replied, staring straight ahead. His voice was flat, emotionless. "But the highway doesn't let you leave." David frowned. "What do you mean?" The man turned to him, his hollow eyes boring into David's. "You'll see." Before David could respond, the car's engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered out, plunging them into darkness. David cursed, twisting the key in the ignition. But the engine wouldn't start. "Great," he muttered, grabbing his phone again. Still no signal. The man in the passenger seat didn't say a word. He just sat there, staring straight ahead. The silence was unbearable. "I'll check under the hood," David said, trying to keep his voice steady. He stepped out of the car, his breath visible in the icy air. As he opened the hood, he noticed something strange. The engine looked fine. There was no reason it shouldn't be running. And then, he heard a faint sound, like whispering, coming from the trees. David froze, his heart pounding. He turned toward the sound, but the trees were still. The whispering grew louder, surrounding him, filling his ears with words he couldn't understand. "Hey!" he shouted, slamming the hood shut. "Who's there?" No response. He hurried back to the car, but when he opened the door, the man was gone. The passenger seat was empty. Panic set in as David scanned the darkness. "Hello?" he called out. The whispering stopped. And then, a voice spoke, clear and cold, right behind him. "You can't leave." David spun around, but no one was there. The highway was empty, stretching endlessly in both directions. He jumped back into the car and turned the key again. This time, the engine roared to life. Without hesitation, he floored the accelerator, speeding down the highway. The mile markers were still stuck on mile 156, but he didn't care. He just wanted to get away. Hours passed. David couldn't tell. The highway seemed to go on forever, a never-ending loop of darkness and asphalt. He was about to lose hope when he saw lights in the distance. An exit sign appeared. Exit 49. 1 mile. Relief flooded him as he sped toward the exit. He didn't care where it led. Anywhere was better than this cursed highway. As he approached the ramp, he glanced in his rearview mirror. His heart stopped. The man from the broken-down car was sitting in the back seat, his hollow eyes staring directly at David. "I told you," the man said, his voice a chilling whisper. "The highway doesn't let you." David screamed, yanking the wheel to the side. The car spun out of control, skidding off the road and into the ditch. The world went black. When David woke up, he was back on the highway. His car was running, and the mile markers read mile 156. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, his mind racing. He was trapped, and as he drove into the endless night, he realized he might never escape. David's breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to steady himself. His knuckles turned white from gripping the steering wheel, and his thoughts spiraled into panic. Was this some kind of nightmare? Had he fallen asleep at the wheel, or was he truly stuck in this unending purgatory? His eyes darted to the dashboard clock. 1:56 a.m. That couldn't be right. He'd been driving for hours, hadn't he? Yet the time remained frozen, as if the highway existed outside reality. "No," he whispered to himself. "There has to be a way out." He forced himself to think logically. He would drive faster, further, until he hit something, anything. David slammed his foot on the gas, pushing the car to its limit. The needle on the speedometer climbed higher, and the trees blurred into dark smudges. The wind howled outside as if protesting his decision. For a brief moment, hope flared in his chest. He thought he saw a flicker of something new. A gas station? A roadside diner? He squinted, but as he drew closer, his heart sank. It wasn't a gas station. It was the same broken-down car he'd stopped at earlier, the hood still open, the hazard lights still blinking. And standing beside it was the same man in the dirty jacket. His pale face turned toward David's approaching car. "No!" David screamed, slamming on the brakes. The car screeched to a halt, but the man was already walking toward him. David could see him clearly now, his hollow eyes locked onto him with an unsettling intensity. David didn't wait into reverse, the tires screeching as he backed away. But no matter how far he reversed, the man remained ahead of him, standing beside the car. It was as if the highway itself was warping reality, folding in on itself to trap him. His breathing grew shallow as he stared at the figure. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice cracked. The man tilted his head, his mouth twisting into a grotesque smile. Then, without warning, he raised a hand and pointed toward the horizon. Of the man's finger, his gaze shifting to the road ahead. In the far distance, he could see faint headlights moving toward him. Another car. Relief mixed with dread. Was it another traveler, or was it something else? Desperation won out, and David decided to flag the car down. He pressed on the gas and drove forward, keeping his eyes fixed on the approaching vehicle. As he drew closer, the headlights grew brighter, and he could make out the shape of an old sedan. David honked his horn, waving his arm out the window. "Hey, stop! Help!" The sedan slowed, pulling to a stop a few feet in front of him. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, David saw another human face, a young woman in the driver's seat, her expression wary but curious. She rolled down her window slightly as David approached. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice cautious. David nodded frantically. "Thank God. I've been stuck on this highway for hours, maybe longer. Something weird is going on. I can't leave, and there's this man." He stopped, glancing over his shoulder. The broken down car and the pale man were gone. "What man?" narrowing her eyes. David's mouth went dry. He was right there," he stammered. "I swear, something's wrong with this place." The woman studied him for a moment, then sighed. "You're not the first person to say that." David blinked. She gestured toward this highway. "It's not normal. People disappear here. Sometimes they show up again, talking about strange things. Sometimes they don't show up at all." David felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Then how are you still here?" The woman shrugged, her face somber. "I've been driving for what feels like days. I've seen things I can't explain. But every time I think I've found a way out, I end up back here." David's heart sank. "So there's no escape?" Then shook her head. "I don't know, but I'm not giving up. I suggest you don't either." They decided to drive together, taking turns leading. The companionship eased some of David's fear, though the oppressive silence of the highway never truly lifted. They tried everything, turning off at non-existent exits, doubling back, even stopping and walking for miles. But no matter what they did, they always ended up back on the same stretch of road. At one point, they pulled over to rest. David leaned against his car, staring up at the starless sky. The woman, whose name he'd learned was Lisa, stood beside him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "What do you think this place is?" David asked quietly. Lisa shook her head. "Hell, maybe. Or some kind of limbo. I've thought about it a lot, and I don't think it's random. I think we're here because we've done something." David frowned. "Like..." Lisa didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I was drunk," she admitted. "The night I ended up here. I shouldn't have been driving, but I thought I could make it home. And then, David's stomach twisted. "You hit someone?" She nodded, her eyes glistening. "A man. He came out of nowhere. I panicked. I didn't stop. I just kept driving. And then, I ended up..." David swallowed hard, the weight of her confession sinking in. He thought back to his own life. Had he done something to deserve this? He couldn't think of anything, but the thought gnawed at him. "What about you?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. "Why are you..." David opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the headlights of another vehicle appeared in the distance. Both he and Lisa froze, their eyes locked on the approaching car. As the vehicle drew closer, David's heart pounded. It was a large truck, its engine rumbling loudly. The driver didn't slow down as he passed, but David caught a glimpse of his face. It was the pale man. His arm, her grip tight. "Did you see him?" she whispered. David nodded, his blood running cold. "He's the one I told you about." The truck disappeared down the highway, its taillights fading into the distance. David and Lisa stared after it, their fear growing. "Maybe," Lisa started, her voice shaky. "Maybe he's the key to getting out." David turned to her, his face pale. "Or maybe he's the reason we're trapped." Lisa didn't respond, but the look in her eyes said it all. They didn't have a choice. If they wanted answers or a chance at freedom, they'd have to follow the truck. They drove in silence, the truck always just a speck on the horizon, as if it were leading them somewhere. The road seemed to stretch even longer, the darkness growing thicker with every mile. Finally, the truck slowed, pulling over to the side of the road. David and Lisa stopped a safe distance away, their nerves fraying. The truck's door opened, and the pale man stepped out. He turned toward them, his hollow eyes glinting in the dark. "Come closer," he called, his voice echoing unnaturally. David and Lisa exchanged a glance. Fear clawed at them, but curiosity and desperation pushed them forward. They got out of the car and approached the man, their footsteps hesitant. "What do you want from us?" David demanded, his voice trembling. The man smiled, a cold, empty smile. "This highway is a test," he said. "For those who are lost, for those who have sinned." Lisa's breath hitched. "A test for what?" "To see truth," the man replied. "Or if you'll keep running." What truth? What was he supposed to face? He opened his mouth to ask, but the ground beneath him suddenly shifted. The highway, the cars, and even the man began to dissolve into darkness. And then, when David opened his eyes, he was sitting in his car, parked on the shoulder of the highway. Morning light streamed through the windshield, and the familiar hum of traffic filled the air. He looked around. The endless highway was gone. Lisa was gone. It was as if none of it had happened. But deep down, David knew it wasn't a dream. The memory of the pale man's words lingered in his mind. Face the truth, or keep running. David started the car, his hands shaking. He didn't know what he'd just experienced, but one thing was clear: he couldn't outrun his past forever. David's car engine purred as he pulled back onto the road. The morning sunlight spilled over the landscape, illuminating the trees, hills, and stretches of farmlands surrounding the highway. Everything looked normal now. Trucks and sedans passed by, their drivers oblivious to the torment David had endured mere hours before. But nothing felt. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his heart thundering in his chest. The pale man's words, "Face the truth or keep running," played over and over in his mind, like a haunting melody he couldn't escape. As David continued driving, his thoughts raced. What truth was he avoiding? He was just an ordinary man, wasn't he? He worked a stable job, lived in a modest apartment, and lived a mostly uneventful life. He couldn't think of anything he'd done that might have led to this test. But the more he told himself that, the less convinced he felt. David decided to stop at a gas station a few miles up the road. It was a small, run-down place with a faded sign that read Miller's Gas and Deli. He parked near the pumps, stepped out, and walked toward the store. The smell of gasoline and stale air greeted him as he entered. The cashier, an older man with a thick mustache, barely glanced at him. David grabbed a bottle of water and a snack from the shelves, but his mind wasn't on food. He approached the counter, his voice hesitant. "Excuse me," David said. Have you ever heard of people getting stuck on this highway?" The cashier looked up slowly, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean, stuck?" David hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I mean, like, driving and not being able to find an exit. Like the road keeps going, and weird things happen." The cashier's expression darkened. He leaned forward, his voice low. "You're not the first person to ask that." David's heart. "I'm not?" The man shook his head. "Been working this place 25 years. Every now and then someone comes through here saying strange things about the highway, seeing people who aren't there, losing track of time, stuff like that." "What happens to them?" David asked, his mouth dry. The cashier shrugged. "Most of them leave. Some look like they've figured something out, like they've made peace with something. Others..." He trailed off, his face grim. "Others don't come back." David stopped. He paid for his items and walked back to his car, the cashier's words echoing in his mind. He sat in the driver's seat, gripping the water bottle tightly. What had he done? Supposed to face? As David resumed his drive, fragments of memories began to surface. Things he hadn't thought about in years. He remembered a snowy night from a decade ago, driving home from a party. He'd had a few drinks, but he hadn't felt drunk. He'd told himself he was fine to drive. The roads were the visibility poor. He was halfway home when something darted in front of his car. A deer? A dog? He never stopped to find out. He remembered the thud, the way the car jolted on impact. He had slammed the brakes, his heart racing, but he never got out to check. Instead, he'd driven off, convincing himself it wasn't his fault. David gripped this as the memory played out in his mind. He'd buried it for years, telling himself it hadn't mattered. But now, it clawed its way back to the surface, refusing to be ignored. Is that himself? Is that why I'm being punished? The sun dipped lower in the sky as David continued driving, his thoughts heavy. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of his vision, and the hum of the road felt almost alive, like it was whispering to him. Eventually, The highway began to change. The smooth asphalt gave way to a cracked, weathered surface. The trees on either side became gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. A dense fog rolled in, shrouding the road in an eerie gray mist. David's pulse quickened. He slowed the car, squinting through the fog. Up ahead, he saw something. A figure standing in the middle of the road. It was the pale man. His tires screeching. The car skidded to a stop just feet from the man, who stood motionless, his hollow eyes fixed on David. "Why are you doing this to me?" David shouted, his voice cracking. "What do you want?" The man didn't respond. He simply raised a hand and pointed. David followed the direction of his finger and saw a faint light in the distance, flickering like a lantern. "What is that?" David asked, but the man remained silent. With a sense of dread, David realized he had no choice. He had to follow the light. The cold air biting at his skin. The fog thickened around him, muffling every sound. He walked toward the light, his heart pounding with every step. As he drew closer, the light grew brighter, illuminating what looked like a small cabin. The cabin was old and weathered, its windows glowing softly. David hesitated at the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. He pushed it open, the door creaking loudly. Inside, the cabin was empty except for a single chair in the center of the room. On the chair sat a small box, its lid slightly ajar. David approached it cautiously, his breath visible in the icy air. He opened the box. Inside was a set of car keys, a familiar set of car keys. His heart sank as he recognized them. They belonged to his old car, the one he'd driven the night of the accident. A weight over him, guilt, shame, and a deep aching sorrow. He sank to his knees, clutching the keys. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." The room seemed to, the air growing warmer. The fog outside began to lift, and sunlight streamed through the windows. David felt a strange sense of peace wash over him, as if a weight had been lifted from his chest. He stood, clutching the keys tightly. When he stepped outside, the highway was different. The trees were green and vibrant, the road smooth and familiar. A sense of calm filled the air. David got back into his car and started the engine. As he drove, he noticed the mile markers changing. Mile 157, mile 158, mile 159. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was moving forward. David never told anyone about what had happened on the highway. But from that day on, he lived differently. He stopped running from his past and started making amends. And though he never saw the pale man again, he often felt a presence, a quiet reminder that the truth would always find him, no matter how far he tried to run. And he never drove on that highway at night again. Months passed, and David began to rebuild his life. The experience on the highway had changed him in ways he couldn't fully explain. He no longer felt like the same person who had spent years ignoring his guilt and barreling through life on autopilot. Instead, he made a conscious effort to confront his past. He quit his high-stress corporate job and took a position at a nonprofit, helping victims of car accidents rebuild their lives. It felt like a small way to give back, a step toward redemption. He even volunteered on weekends at a local animal shelter, finding a strange comfort in caring for creatures that couldn't speak but seemed to understand him in ways others didn't. But the highway, it lingered in his thoughts, always in the back of his mind. No matter how much good he did, David couldn't shake the feeling that the highway wasn't entirely done with him. At night, he dreamed of foggy roads and flickering headlights. Sometimes he would wake up in a cold sweat, the pale man's hollow eyes etched into his memory. And then, one evening, everything changed again. David was sitting on his couch, flipping through a photo album he'd found buried in a closet. It was filled with snapshots of his childhood, birthday parties, family vacations, and school photos. The innocent smiles stared back at him, reminding him of a time before life had grown so complicated. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a number he didn't recognize, but something compelled him to answer. "Hello?" David said, his voice cautious. For a moment, there was only static. Then a distorted voice crackled through the line. David's blood ran cold. "Who is this?" The voice didn't respond immediately, but when it did, it was clearer and familiar. You know who I am?" David's heart pounded. It was the pale man. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice trembling. "You've made progress," the man said, his tone eerily calm. "But your journey isn't." David's grip on the phone tightened. "I've done everything I can. I've made amends. I've tried to be better. What else do you want from me?" The line went dead. David stared at the phone, his hands shaking. He knew this wasn't over. The highway hadn't released him, it had only given him a reprieve. That night, David found himself unable to sleep. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with questions. What did the pale man mean? What more was he supposed to do? At 3 a.m. he gave up trying to rest. He grabbed his car keys and stepped outside, the crisp night air biting at his skin. Without fully understanding why, he got into his car and started driving. The streets of his town were quiet, bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. David drove aimlessly, his thoughts swirling. Before he realized it, he was on the highway again. Not that highway, he told himself, just a regular highway. But as the miles rolled by, the scenery began to change. The trees grew denser, their branches gnarled and twisting. The road became cracked and uneven. And then, like slipping into a familiar nightmare, the fog rolled in. David's chest tightened. He gripped the wheel, his palms sweaty. "No," he whispered, "not again." But the highway didn't care about his protests. It had drawn him back, pulling him into its grasp like a predator toying with its prey. As he drove, the fog grew thicker, reducing visibility to almost nothing. David slowed the car, his heart hammering in his chest. The oppressive silence pressed in on him, broken only by the hum of his engine. Then, in the distance, he saw it, the pale man, standing in the middle of the road. David's first instinct was to slam on the brakes, but something stopped him. This time, he didn't feel fear. Instead, he felt determination. He brought the car to a stop and stepped out, his breath visible in the icy air. The pale man watched him, his hollow eyes glinting in the faint light. "You brought me back," David said, his voice steady. "What?" The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he gestured to the side of the road, where a new figure emerged from the fog. David's stomach turned as he recognized the figure, a young man, no older than 25, with wide, fearful eyes. "I was just trying to get home," the young man said, his voice trembling. "I didn't see the car until it was too late." David's breath hitched. The memory came flooding back. The snowy night, the figure darting in front of his car, the thud of impact. For years he had convinced himself it was an animal. But now, faced with the truth, he couldn't deny it. "You," David's voice cracked. "You're the one I—" The young man nodded, his expression pained. "I've been stuck here ever since, waiting, watching." David's knees buckled, and he sank to the ground. "I'm sorry," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry. I didn't stop. I didn't even check if you were alive. I was selfish, and I was scared." The young man knelt beside him, his expression softening. "I know, and I forgive you. But forgiveness isn't enough. You have to forgive yourself." David looked up, his vision blurred by tears. The young man reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. In that moment, David felt a warmth spread through him, a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The fog began to lift, and the pale man stepped forward. "Your journey is complete," he said, his voice calm. "You faced the truth. Now you can move on." David stood, his legs trembling. He turned to thank the young man, but he was gone. The highway around him transformed, the cracked asphalt smoothing, the twisted trees straightening into lush greenery. The oppressive silence was replaced by the hum of normal traffic. David got back into his car and drove. This time the mile markers changed steadily, leading him home. For the first time in years, he felt free, free from guilt, free from fear, free from the endless highway. Though the highway never called him back, David never forgot the lessons it had taught him. He lived the rest of his life with purpose, helping others and cherishing every moment. And when the time finally came for him to leave this world, he faced it without fear, knowing the highway may have been endless, but David's journey had finally come to an end.